Ladies and gentlemen, today I want to explore a dynamic that so many people experience but rarely understand: why an avoidant person panics when you stop reacting with pain and start responding with peace. At first glance, it doesn't make sense. You would think that your calmness, your emotional neutrality, your peaceful energy would soothe the situation. But to someone with avoidant tendencies, your peace isn't comforting, it's disorienting. It disrupts the entire script they've been rehearsing their whole life. Avoidants operate from a belief that closeness is dangerous and emotional intensity is overwhelming. They expect people to either chase them, demand from them, or fall apart the moment they withdraw. They believe, consciously or not, that their distance gives them control. It creates predictability. They know what happens when they pull away. You react, you protest, you try harder, you fight for clarity. And though they may claim they don't like these reactions, they understand them. Those reactions confirm a story they've lived with for years. People always need too much from me. Intimacy is unsafe. I'm better off alone. But peace shatters that story. When you respond with calmness, composure, and confidence, something profound happens. You remove the emotional pressure they always brace themselves for. You show them a version of connection they never learned to navigate. Connection without chaos, attachment without suffocation, love without demand. And for someone who has built their identity around protecting themselves, this is terrifying. Your peace makes them reflect. Suddenly, their distancing behavior isn't met with panic or pleading. It's met with stability. It's met with someone who can hold themselves, someone who is not controlled by fear, someone who doesn't need them, but chooses them. This flips their entire nervous system, because now the fear isn't about losing themselves in closeness. The fear is about losing you. Your peace highlights their patterns instead of enabling them. Your peace exposes the gap between their emotional capacity and yours. Your peace reveals that you can communicate in a way they never learned. And that presence, your grounded, secure presence, forces them to confront their own avoidance, their own wounds, their own emotional immaturity. This is why some avoidants retreat even further when you respond with calmness, not because you did something wrong, not because they don't care, but because your peace brings up their unhealed places. It interrupts their usual loop, and suddenly they don't know what role to play anymore. But here's the beauty. Your peace also shows them what healthy love looks like. It models stability. It models safety. It models what it means to be with someone who doesn't weaponize emotion or rely on conflict for connection. And whether they admit it or not, your peace is the first time they feel seen without feeling overwhelmed. So if you're someone who has responded with love, clarity, and calm, and it seems to make them panic, understand this. Your peace is not the problem. Your peace is the mirror. Your peace is the upgrade. Your peace is the thing their fear never prepared them for. And whether they grow from it or run from it, never downgrade your emotional intelligence just to match someone else's emotional avoidance. Because peace doesn't just change relationships, it changes you. And the people meant for you will rise to meet it. Thank you. When an avoidant person encounters your peace, it disrupts the emotional pattern they've relied on for years to maintain a sense of control and predictability in relationships. Their nervous system is trained to expect conflict, intensity, or emotional pursuit whenever they pull away. They assume that if they withdraw, the other person will react with panic, insecurity, or frustration. This reaction serves as confirmation that closeness is dangerous, that intimacy is overwhelming, and that other people will always demand more than they can give. But when you respond with calmness instead of chaos, the script they expect completely collapses. Your peace doesn't just quiet the situation, it destabilizes their internal map of how relationships are supposed to go. Avoidants often operate from a subconscious belief that emotional distance keeps them safe. They prepare themselves for emotional fallout long before it appears. They anticipate being pressured, chased, or needed in ways they feel unequipped to handle. So when none of that happens, when instead they are met with a gentle, grounded presence, it leaves them with no familiar cues to lean on. They suddenly aren't sure what role to play because the fears they prepared for never arrive. That uncertainty triggers anxiety, not because you've done anything wrong, but because your response doesn't match the emotional world they've learned to survive in. Your peace essentially breaks their predictability loop. They expect your pain to justify their withdrawal, but peace provides no justification at all. It challenges the narrative they've held onto for years. People are too much for me. I can't give them what they want. I'm safer at a distance. When you aren't asking for anything, when you aren't emotionally collapsing, when you aren't chasing, the avoidant suddenly loses the anchor they use to stabilize their own fear. They've spent years building a defensive structure around the idea that emotional closeness equals emotional pressure. But now you show them closeness doesn't have to be heavy, yet they still feel overwhelmed because they don't know how to function in this new paradigm. This is why some avoidants react by pulling back even more when peace enters the equation. Not because peace is threatening in itself, but because it removes their excuses. It shifts the dynamic from I'm withdrawing because you're overwhelming me to I'm withdrawing even though you're being calm and respectful. And that second version forces them to confront themselves in ways they aren't accustomed to. They can no longer point to your emotional reaction as the trigger. Their behavior becomes the only variable left, and facing that reality can feel deeply uncomfortable. Your peace also holds a subtle power they aren't prepared for. It shows emotional regulation. It shows maturity. It shows someone who isn't controlled by fear. And that level of groundedness feels foreign to a person who has lived most of their relational life in a state of quiet panic. They don't quite know what to do with someone who doesn't try to grip onto them. They don't know how to respond to someone who remains secure, even in uncertainty. And that unpredictability makes your peace more disruptive than any emotional reaction ever could. In that disruption lies transformation, but in the beginning, it often looks like panic, distance, or confusion, simply because your peace breaks the pattern they've always used to feel emotionally safe. When you respond to an avoidant person with calmness instead of reacting with panic or frustration, you create a space where their internal dynamics are exposed in a way they are rarely forced to confront. Avoidants often build their emotional life around strategies designed to protect themselves, which usually include distance, emotional withdrawal, or defensiveness. These strategies are reinforced over years, sometimes decades, because every interaction they've had in which someone reacted with need, fear, or anger validated their belief that closeness is dangerous. They learned early on that other people's emotions could be overwhelming or even threatening, and over time, they internalized the idea that controlling distance is safer than vulnerability. When you stay composed and peaceful in response to their distancing or withdrawal, you remove the safety net of their familiar patterns. Your emotional stability exposes a gap they rarely have to face, the gap between the person they've become and the person they could be if they allowed themselves to be fully present in connection. Avoidants are often unaware of how much their defensive patterns are influencing their relationships. They may assume that their withdrawal is a neutral or even protective behavior, rather than something that creates confusion or hurt in others. When you react with panic or frustration, they can continue to believe that their avoidance is justified. Your reaction becomes proof that closeness is dangerous. But your peace changes the equation. It shows them that someone can respond with clarity, patience, and understanding without collapsing into emotional chaos. This exposes their behavior for what it really is: a learned defense, not an objective truth. It forces a subtle but profound reckoning with the reality that their avoidance isn't a natural law of relationships, but a habit that can be observed and challenged. Your calmness also creates a mirror effect. Avoidants are not accustomed to seeing themselves reflected in a way that doesn't include judgment or reactive emotion. When you respond with peace, they have the chance to observe the consequences of their avoidance without the distraction of emotional escalation. They begin to notice how their distancing affects others, and more importantly, they begin to see it as something they have the ability to change if they choose to. This reflection can feel uncomfortable, even destabilizing, because it challenges the identity they've built around being self-sufficient, emotionally untouchable, or independent at all costs. They are forced to confront the fact that their habits might be limiting not just the connection with others, but also their own emotional growth. This exposure often triggers a range of responses, from curiosity and introspection to anxiety or even temporary withdrawal. It's not that they dislike your presence or your calmness, it's that they are unaccustomed to it, and it challenges the assumptions they have used to navigate life. Your composure shines a light on the defensive structures they've relied upon and makes them visible in a way that is both revealing and transformative. In essence, your calm response doesn't just change the interaction, it subtly, persistently exposes the underlying patterns that have governed their relationships, inviting them to step into a more aware and emotionally mature way of being. Avoidant individuals are not afraid of people. They are afraid of intimacy. This fear is deeply rooted in their experiences, often formed early in life where emotional closeness was associated with vulnerability, disappointment, or even pain. They have learned consciously or unconsciously that allowing someone too close could lead to being overwhelmed, controlled, or hurt. Over time, this creates a protective mechanism, withdrawal. They distance themselves emotionally to maintain a sense of safety and autonomy, often convincing themselves that closeness is inherently risky. When someone responds to their withdrawal with panic, frustration, or emotional intensity, it reinforces their belief that emotional connection is dangerous. It validates their strategy of avoidance because every reaction confirms the narrative that intimacy equals danger. However, when someone responds with calmness, composure, and understanding, it introduces a new paradigm that they have rarely, if ever, encountered: closeness without threat, connection without suffocation, love without pressure. Your calm and stable response presents them with a version of intimacy they are not familiar with. It challenges the automatic defenses they have relied on for so long. They are used to interactions that escalate, that require them to protect themselves, and that make them feel cornered. Peaceful responses do not trigger these learned reactions. Instead, they highlight the difference between relationships built on fear and those built on trust. This unfamiliarity can be confusing and even frightening. They are confronted with the idea that closeness doesn't have to feel overwhelming and that someone can love, care, or connect without demanding or controlling. The avoidance that once felt safe now feels unnecessary and yet uncomfortable because it leaves them unpracticed in responding to a healthier dynamic. Avoidants often struggle with recognizing their own emotional needs because their coping mechanisms have prioritized independence over connection. Your calm approach encourages them to reflect without forcing them to act or react in a pressured way. It models emotional regulation and healthy communication, demonstrating that closeness can exist without fear. This can trigger a subtle internal conflict. They may want to connect, to engage, and to experience closeness, but their fear of vulnerability holds them back. Your composed presence gently nudges them toward recognizing that intimacy can be safe, but it also exposes the gap between their desire for connection and their current emotional patterns. It is important to understand that this fear of intimacy is not about rejecting you personally. It is about the internalized fear of being emotionally exposed. Avoidance may retreat temporarily when confronted with someone who responds with peace because they are encountering an unfamiliar way of relating. Your calmness is not threatening, but it forces them to confront their avoidance, making them aware of the walls they have built. Over time, consistent, peaceful responses can help them feel secure enough to lower those walls, explore vulnerability, and engage in deeper connection. By responding with peace instead of reacting with pain, you demonstrate a form of intimacy that avoidant individuals can trust. You show them that closeness can be experienced without panic or chaos. You provide a safe space in which their defenses can relax, and in doing so, you challenge their fear of intimacy in a gentle, non-confrontational way. Your presence becomes a model for how relationships can exist in a healthy, secure, and emotionally intelligent space, offering them the opportunity to experience connection as something nurturing rather than threatening. When you respond to an avoidant person with calmness and emotional stability, you inadvertently remove the very sense of control they have relied on to navigate relationships. Avoidants often manage intimacy and connection by creating distance, withdrawing, or emotionally detaching. These behaviors give them the illusion of safety. They can predict and manage the flow of interaction because they control the pace, intensity, and proximity. Over time, this creates a sense of security in their avoidance patterns. They have learned that by keeping others at arm's length, they minimize emotional risk. But when you respond with peace instead of reacting with panic, anger, or desperation, that predictable dynamic disappears, and with it, their sense of control. They suddenly encounter a scenario they cannot manipulate with the usual patterns they rely on. Your calmness challenges their internal scripts. Avoidants expect conflict, emotional escalation, or frantic attempts to win them back whenever they withdraw or distance themselves. These reactions are familiar, and while they may complain about the intensity, they also understand it. They can anticipate it and feel they know how to respond. When none of that happens, when you do not mirror their tension, plead for attention, or escalate the situation, they experience a new type of uncertainty. Your peace shifts the dynamic from reactive chaos to steady equilibrium, leaving them without the usual levers of control. The very tools they use to protect themselves, withdrawal, detachment, emotional withholding, lose their familiar effect because your composed response does not demand, provoke, or chase. This lack of predictable reaction forces them to confront the reality that relationships do not have to be a battleground. They begin to notice that their defensive strategies may no longer be necessary to maintain connection. This can trigger anxiety or even temporary withdrawal because the absence of emotional drama creates unfamiliar territory. They are no longer able to rely on the external chaos to guide their behavior. In other words, your self-control exposes the power they have been relying on in relationships, the power of creating tension, eliciting reactions, and controlling proximity. When that tool is removed, they are forced to navigate connection differently, often for the first time. Your peace also models an alternative way of being. By remaining grounded, you demonstrate that stability is not weakness, and that calm presence can coexist with intimacy. This can be disorienting because it contradicts the patterns they have used to justify avoidance. For someone who has built their relational identity around distance and self-protection, this challenges not only their behavior, but also the story they tell themselves about why they need to avoid closeness. The new dynamic asks them to meet connection with awareness rather than instinctive defense. Importantly, removing the sense of control is not about manipulating or punishing them. It is about holding your own emotional ground, establishing boundaries, and showing that you can navigate the relationship with clarity and composure. Your calmness creates a safe environment where the avoidant is confronted with the choice: continue retreating into old patterns or engage in connection without resistance. While initially your peace may trigger panic or confusion, over time it encourages growth. They begin to see that emotional presence does not have to be overwhelming and that connection can exist on equal, balanced, and healthy terms. Your steady response is a catalyst for transformation, forcing them to reckon with their patterns and inspiring the possibility of authentic intimacy. When you respond to an avoidant individual with peace, instead of reacting with pain, your composure becomes both a mirror and a model for them. Avoidants often have a limited internal map of what healthy connection looks like because their formative experiences may have associated closeness with discomfort, pressure, or fear. They may have learned early that emotional exposure leads to rejection or that expressing needs invites judgment or disappointment. Over time, this creates a pattern in which they protect themselves by withdrawing, distancing, or emotionally detaching. These behaviors become so ingrained that they may not even recognize them as defense mechanisms. They simply feel like survival strategies. When you respond calmly, without panic, anger, or emotional escalation, you reflect back to them a way of relating that they rarely experience: connection without chaos, intimacy without suffocation, and boundaries without conflict. Your peace functions as a mirror because it shows them both their impact on relationships and the contrast between their habitual patterns and the potential for a healthier dynamic. This reflection can be unsettling. Avoidants are accustomed to seeing relationships through a lens of expected tension or predictable reactions. When someone responds with calmness, they suddenly confront the reality of their avoidance without the familiar distractions of emotional drama. They begin to notice how their withdrawal or defensive strategies influence the connection. They might recognize that their fear of closeness has led to misunderstandings, missed opportunities for emotional connection, or repeated patterns of distance. Your peace illuminates these blind spots without judgment, creating awareness rather than conflict. This awareness is often the first step toward emotional growth because it allows them to observe themselves objectively, even if it initially triggers anxiety or uncertainty. At the same time, your calm response serves as a model. By demonstrating emotional regulation, consistent boundaries, and thoughtful communication, you show avoidants that relationships can function in ways that don't rely on conflict or avoidance. They see that someone can engage in connection while remaining grounded, assertive, and secure. This modeling is powerful because avoidants often lack real-life examples of how closeness can exist without triggering panic or pressure. Your behavior provides a live demonstration of emotional intelligence, teaching them, without words, that stability and intimacy are compatible. The combination of mirror and model creates both challenge and opportunity. On one hand, your peace exposes the gaps between their current behavior and the kind of connection they could experience. On the other hand, it shows them a path forward. They are confronted with their avoidance and simultaneously offered a blueprint for how to relate differently. This dual effect can provoke temporary retreat or discomfort because it asks them to confront long-held fears and assumptions. Yet it also invites growth, as they are given a safe example of how intimacy can function without overwhelm or coercion. Ultimately, your calm and consistent presence encourages avoidants to step into emotional maturity at their own pace. It allows them to see that connection does not require surrendering autonomy or giving in to fear. Your peace becomes a reference point for what healthy relationships can look like: steady, respectful, and emotionally safe. Over time, this mirror and model dynamic can help them gradually lower defenses, engage more fully, and develop the capacity for authentic intimacy. By responding with peace, rather than reacting with pain, you offer not just stability for the present moment, but a template for relational growth that can transform their patterns and their experience of connection. In conclusion, responding to an avoidant with peace rather than pain is not only a powerful act of self-mastery, but also a transformative mirror for them, showing that connection can exist without chaos, fear, or control. Your calm presence disrupts old patterns, exposes unhealed wounds, and models a healthier way to relate, giving them the opportunity to grow while preserving your own emotional integrity. Remember, your peace is not a weakness. It is your strength, your clarity, and your invitation to authentic connection. Thank you all for taking the time to reflect on this dynamic and for committing to relationships rooted in understanding, patience, and emotional intelligence.